Welcome everyone to our latest webinar with East Sussex Fire and Rescue Service. These webinars are supported by the Office for Product Safety and Standards within the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We're joined today by Kelly Connolly and Raj Baksi from East Sussex Fire and Rescue Service, and we'll be talking about risk assessments within small guest accommodation. The focus of this conversation is for people who own guest houses and sort of smaller accommodation businesses. And I think particularly for our membership, one of the things that keeps coming up is risk assessments. And in our conversations, that's one of the main sort of focus points where I think there's some anxiety around it about how to create them. And also there's lots of companies out there that claim to be, able to do this and do that. And I think through COVID, what we've noticed, especially, is a lot of companies emailing saying, well, we can help you with this bit of the legislation and we can do this and we can do that. And then what ends up happening is some businesses end up spending lots of money on things that maybe they don't need. So the purpose of this conversation was really just to talk through the risk assessment process, some of the pitfalls that you can get into, looking at some signposting. If we could start just by if you two could go through the 5 stages of a risk assessment and what that process is in relation to a smaller guest accommodation.
Okay, shall I take this one, Rod?
Yeah, carry on.
Okay, so what we do have for small guest houses is a leaflet called "Do You Have Paying Guests?" And what that does, it sort of breaks down what it is you need to do, but also it gives really, really good information on what fire safety precautions you need in a certain size guest house. So where we always say we're not specific, this is quite specific in the information it's given to the responsible person. So it's telling you the type of alarm system you can have. And that's very rare in fire safety to be given specific information like that. So that leaflet is available. It's called "Do You Have Paying Guests?" And it's available on our intranet service, which is www.esfrs.org. But also, if you just Google it, it will come up. Do you have paying guests? Because it's a government leaflet. What I would say is, if you don't have any fire safety experience or knowledge, or you're unsure, it is sometimes difficult to do your own risk assessment. So you may start to do it, but because you haven't got that sort of underpinning knowledge, you may end up missing something. So what we do say is, if you are unsure, do seek the help of someone who is a competent risk assessor. But we do have the IFE, the Institute of Fire Engineers, and they have a website where they do have a list of competent fire risk assessors, and they are assessed by the IFE.
Ellie, we're talking about, you say it's a competent person. Is that what the legislation?
What the legislation asks for is someone who is competent. So what they base competency on, they don't actually say you need to have this qualification or you need to have this job, or it's not as specific as that. So how they base competency is knowledge, understanding, skills, and there's a fourth one which has left my mind for a moment. So that's how they base competency. So what we do say is, if you've got like a risk assessment background, you may be able to transfer those skills into a fire risk assessment. But if you've got a complex building, or if your building doesn't fit this "Do you have paying guests?", you may need that little bit of extra input on the fire safety part. So a lot of people just get it and put it to one side. It should just be constantly updated when it's needed. So the review should be, if something happens or something changes, there's a significant change, but if anything that you're doing fire safety wise should be put into that document. So if you did pay for a competent person to do your fire risk assessment, you may not have to do that every year, pay for someone to do it, because you can just review it with the knowledge and understanding that they've given you in that document. You can be rest assured that the information they've given you is right.
Could you just talk us through when someone does do a risk assessment, whether it's yourself or you get another organisation in, what are the actual 5 stages?
So the 5 stages to risk assessment are to identify the people at risk. So that could be your guests, visitors, contractors, staff, lone workers, if you have people that are working on their own at night. So first of all, you need to identify the people that are at risk. So step 2 is to look at all the hazards that you've got in your hotel or bed and breakfast. So you're looking for potential fuel sources. Oxygen is obviously everywhere. So and it's the 3 steps to fire, isn't it? So you've got oxygen, you've got your fuel, and you've got your ignition sources. So that's what you're looking at. Step 3 is to evaluate the risk. So this is where you're looking at, right, I've got this problem. Is what I've got at the moment in my property reducing that risk? Step 4 is recording your findings. Now, there's always this sort of misunderstanding around if you employ 5 people. So there's something in the legislation that says you don't need to record it unless you have more than 5 people, or you've got a license, or you've got a alterations notice. Now, what the misunderstanding of that is, you don't have to record your fire risk assessment, as in the assessment that you're doing, but you should record your significant findings. So if you're going to the hassle of recording your significant findings, you have to go through a process anyway. So our recommendation is, well, if you're doing it, you might as well write it down. You don't have to write it down. You only have to write down the significant findings, but it just seems ludicrous to not write it down if you're doing that process. Because also, if we come along, if you haven't written it down, we'll be asking you loads of questions of how you got these significant findings. What was you doing? What were you looking at? What was you assessing? So if you've got a license for any alcohol, food, anything like that, you must record the whole lot. So that will be most hotels and bed and breakfasts, I would assume, would have some sort of license. So that would mean that has to be recorded, the whole lot. And then step 5 is reviewing it. So as we said earlier, that could be annually. It might be more often. If you're having work done, it would be quite regularly. But it should be reviewed any time you do anything in relation to fire safety. So if you're going around and doing maintenance on your doors, fire doors, record that in your fire risk assessment. If you've got some new training that you're going to do for your staff, record that on your fire risk assessment. So it's not just negatives, it's positives, the positives that you're doing for fire safety. A lot of people just think that it's all the negative significant findings. It's not that, it's everything. So they're the 5 steps.
Brilliant, thank you for that. That's really helpful. In our previous conversations, we've talked about the importance of keeping records. And you were sort of going over why that's so important in terms of, if something did happen. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. So
we can't force you to keep records. So there's nothing in the legislation to say that, you must keep a record of your check of your fire alarm system or your emergency lighting. But what it does say is you need to be able to show that you are testing these pieces of equipment. So again, it makes sense to keep these records because how else do you prove it? It's a bit of a catch-22. But not only that, it helps you to keep records because if you're testing your fire alarm system and there's an issue with it, you can look back and go, actually, we've had this issue 5 times. So it gives you a better understanding of how your fire alarm system is working. Also, if you're recording all your false alarms, you can identify maybe that there's an issue with a certain detector or that a detector could be sited in the wrong position, but it gives you that history. So we can't force you to keep records, but we do recommend it. And again, we do have on our system a book where you can record all of your, it covers every single fire safety provision. So it, you know, some of it might not be relevant to everybody because it's got sprinklers, fire alarm systems, fire doors. But on the front page or the second page, it gives you a list of when these tests need to be done. So it's a reminder for you of, I need to test my emergency lighting monthly. I need to check my fire doors weekly. You know, so it just gives you that little bit of understanding of what needs to be done and when. So it sort of jogs your memory a little bit, and that can be downloaded from our website because a lot of people like to keep them on their computer so they can just update them electronically rather than a handwritten copy. But you can do it handwritten if you want to. We can't force you to keep records, but it is recommended.
When we're thinking about templates for a risk assessment, where would you recommend sort of looking?
The Pink Book, which is which I think that you guys use. So the Pink Book uses the template from the National Fire Chiefs Council, NFCC, which obviously we are part of. But we also have a template on our website. But there's many templates out there. I think there's even a template on the Do You Have Paying Guests? Or if not, it does certainly break down what you need to look at. So there are lots of templates, but obviously the NFCC one we would sort of recommend more than others because it's something that's come from the Fire Chiefs Council.
Brilliant, thank you for that. When we're actually looking at the significant findings and when we're recording, we had a conversation previously when we were planning this webinar, and I mentioned to you about fire alarm systems, especially in sort of smaller properties. There could be a variety of different ages and different types of. I wondered if you could just touch on that really, about what you're looking for in terms of benchmark standards. And then,
well, that is exactly what we look for. So we will only go for the benchmark standards. So as I'm sure you're aware and your members will be aware, the British standards do change. I mean, they're not all the time, but you know, over the last few years, the fire alarm British standard has changed quite a bit. We wouldn't expect you to bring your current alarm system up to the current British standard. So as long as it's working and as long as it's providing the right coverage, so that's the key word, is the coverage, then that's fine. As soon as it breaks or sometimes it's a bit like central heating. You have this heating system for so long and then they run out of parts for it. So that's what happens with fire alarm systems. They just stop making the parts for it. So eventually, when it does start to go wrong and they can't repair it, that's when we'd expect you to come up to the actual British standard. But as you'll see in the Do You Have Paying Guests, a domestic system is acceptable in some small premises as long as it's interlinked. So you know, you're not expected to have like the fire alarm panel, but you are expected to have the coverage and that everyone be able to hear the alarm should it go off. That's why that's quite a niche leaflet, the Do You Have Paying Guests, because it's quite specific on the size, the number of people that you have staying there, so that will only fit a very small amount of people, that document. But as I said, we would only we look at coverage. Normally in a hotel it's L2 coverage, so L1 is obviously absolutely everywhere. You'd probably get that in a care home, L1 coverage. L2 is your means of escape and any rooms off of the means of escape. So obviously your bedrooms and any risk rooms. So that would be your lounges, kitchens. So it's almost everywhere, but not quite like an L1 system. So that's the normal coverage we would expect.
That's fair enough. That's why it's obviously very individual to each premises, because they're not perfect.
Yeah, but generally an L2 system would be adequate for a hotel, generally.
Yeah. And Raj, you're obviously working in commercial training side of things, and you were talking to me a bit about what's available to businesses in terms of support. I just wondered if you could just maybe do a quick overview of that.
Yes, of course, I'm very happy to. So we provide training in different formats. Now, normally we do face-to-face training, but that's currently on hold. So we're offering a webinar instead. And it's very easy to access. We can run it at whatever time of day suits the customer. And I think one thing that makes our webinar slightly different, well, there's a lot of good things. It's interactive, it's live, but we run them specifically for specific businesses. So you won't be mixed in with another organisation. And that way we can tailor it and make it, really fit for purpose for the given organisation. And that includes, we could include photographs and relevant information to the site. But it's very easy to access. It's booked by myself. I'm the instructor on the course as well. And we use a whole range of real case studies to bring the topic to life, so that all the relevance that Kelly's been discussing, and all of these things like fire doors and an appreciation of detection. It's not at a technical level because it's aimed at staff instead of managers, but it gives your staff sufficient information to really gain a thorough understanding of what we're trying to achieve in terms of making buildings and people safer. I think a lot of people have a fear of enforcers. Well, we know that, don't we? That's a given. They have a fear of enforcement, and they have a fear that if the fire service or a regulatory body comes in and there are flaws and gaps and holes in their procedures, then they fear of the worst. It's much better to be open and upfront and demonstrate, we know our fire alarm needs modification. We've booked it in, budget reason or whatever the reason may be. We're satisfied in the short term that what we've got is sufficient, but in the longer term, we're going to do this, 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 and this. Yeah. Here's our plan of action. That's so much more positively perceived and seen than what Kelly, the alternative is, oh, sorry, I didn't realise. And that's where the staff, on our courses, we do fire development, smoke travel, human behaviour, and a lot of things that just don't spring to mind automatically. And also home safety is built in, because if your staff are bought in on home safety, they're much more likely, it gives them a sense of appreciation as well, that it's included in the training, and that, the employer cares about them and all that kind of stuff. But also then it boosts their understanding and knowledge of, because we know it is quite easy, isn't it, to see something and sort of brush it under the carpet. But, the bottom line, and we don't want to terrify people, but the bottom line is if workplaces don't have adequate fire precautions, people can get hurt, livelihoods can get affected. And in the worst extreme case, when you look at the failure rate of businesses that have a large fire, it is quite staggering.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really great overview.